The year was 1864, a time when whispers of war had already infiltrated every corner of the nation. A weary fog of despair hung in the air, thick with the weight of a divided America. In the small, isolated town, nestled between dense forests and rolling hills, the war had barely touched the lives of the townspeople. Yet, there was a palpable sense of unease, an inexplicable chill that had been growing over the past few months. When the child appeared, it was as though the town had been caught in a spell, as though some malevolent force had chosen this place to manifest. It was a cold morning when she first appeared on the outskirts of town. The wind howled through the trees, making the sound of rustling leaves seem like distant whispers of something far worse. A group of workers who had been out collecting firewood saw her first, emerging from the dense woods that bordered the town. She walked slowly, almost as if she were in a trance, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her clothes were ragged and torn, dirt streaking her face, and her small hands were clenched tight to her sides. She seemed so small, a child no older than 10, yet her presence felt anything but innocent. At first, the workers thought she was lost, perhaps a refugee from one of the nearby battles or a child whose family had been scattered in the chaos of war. They tried to approach her gently, asking if she was all right, if she needed help. But the child did not respond with the typical fear or confusion one might expect from a lost, frightened youngster. She simply stared at them with a piercing intensity, her eyes strangely old for her face, as though she had seen things no child should. There was no trembling, no begging for help, just an unsettling silence. When the workers finally spoke to her, her voice was barely above a whisper, but what she said sent a shiver through their spines. "They've been watching me. They know where I am. It's not over yet." The words didn't make sense. The workers exchanged uneasy glances, their minds struggling to make sense of what they had heard. A child, lost, dirty, alone, speaking cryptic words, words that hinted at some unseen terror. But what struck them most was the absence of any obvious trauma. She seemed unaffected by the cold, unaffected by hunger, as though she had simply appeared from nowhere. It was as if the forest itself had birthed her. Her calmness in the face of such a dire situation was unsettling. Word of the girl's arrival spread quickly, and soon the townspeople gathered in small clusters to discuss the stranger. Some suggested she had simply wandered off from a nearby family, perhaps displaced by the chaos of war. Others weren't so sure. It was rare, after all, for a child to wander so far into the wilderness without a trace. The woods surrounding the town were thick with dense undergrowth, and it was a wonder she hadn't been lost or harmed. No one could recall seeing her before, and none of the families in the area had reported a missing child. It was as if she had appeared from thin air. By the time the town's constable arrived to take charge, the girl had already been brought into the local inn by a concerned widow, Mrs. Greaves, who had taken pity on her. The constable was an older man, used to handling the usual troubles of a small, quiet town. He was skeptical of the rumors, though the strange behavior of the child made him pause. He questioned the girl, trying to understand where she had come from. But her answers were cryptic, just as they had been with the workers. She spoke in riddles, giving the impression that she was speaking in code. "They are coming for me," she said at one point, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "They said I'd be safe here, but they are coming." The constable left the inn with a heavy heart, unsure of how to proceed. He didn't believe in superstitions, but something about the girl seemed wrong, like a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. He questioned the widow who had taken her in, but she could offer no concrete explanation. All she could say was that the child was quiet, even eerie, and that she had a strange way of looking at things, as though she were seeing something beyond the present. As the days passed, the child's odd behavior began to manifest more clearly. She would often sit by the window, staring out at the trees, her face expressionless. At times, she would murmur to herself, as though conversing with an unseen companion. And though she rarely spoke directly to anyone, her actions grew increasingly unsettling. In one instance, Mrs. Greaves found the child standing at the door, staring into the distance with a vacant expression. When asked what she was doing, the child simply replied, "They will be here soon. They always come back when it's dark." At first, the townspeople attributed this to the trauma of war. Perhaps she had seen things no child should have had to witness. But there was something different about the way she spoke. The words seemed too precise, too deliberate. There was an intelligence behind her eyes that belied her young age. It was as though she knew more than she was letting on, as though she was waiting for something, but wasn't sure when it would come. That sense of expectancy, of tension, gripped everyone who came near her. And then, the first truly strange thing happened. It was just after sunset when a local farmer, Elias Cooper, reported hearing voices coming from the woods near the outskirts of town. He described it as whispers on the wind, and at first, he thought he was imagining things. But when he went to investigate, he found nothing. No person, no sign of disturbance, just an eerie stillness that seemed to settle over the forest. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. As he turned to leave, the sound of footsteps behind him startled him. When he spun around, no one was there. But he couldn't shake the overwhelming sense that the child had somehow been the cause of this unsettling experience. The townsfolk were torn. Some wanted to dismiss the girl as a victim of circumstance, a product of the chaos surrounding them. But others, more superstitious, began to wonder if there was something far darker at play. Was she truly just a lost child, or was there something more to her presence? Could it be that she had been sent as a messenger, or worse, as a harbinger of something far more sinister? The questions grew with each passing day. And though no one had the answers, the town was slowly beginning to change. The air seemed heavier, as if the child's arrival had shifted something in the very fabric of reality. People began to notice that strange things were happening, animals acting skittish, the trees in the forest moving unnaturally in the wind, the sunlight taking on a strange, sickly hue. No one could explain it, but it was clear that the child's presence was doing something to the land itself. It was as if the earth had become aware of her, and it was holding its breath, waiting for the next act in this chilling mystery to unfold. The town where the child was discovered had been shaped by the land itself, a quiet, nearly forgotten settlement tucked away in the hills of a nation at war with itself. Its roads were narrow and winding, curving through dense patches of forest that seemed to swallow up the faint light of dawn. The buildings were old, constructed of timber and stone, their foundations cracked and weathered by years of isolation. This was a place where time moved slowly, and the pulse of the world beyond the hills had little impact on its day-to-day life. Here, people lived off the land, farming and trading with those few other settlements nearby, content in their routines, if not altogether wealthy. At first glance, the town seemed nothing more than a relic of the past, untouched by the growing civil war that had torn the country apart. News from the outside world came slowly, passed along through travelers and letters carried by horseback. The local paper was outdated, more concerned with grain prices and seasonal weather patterns than the battles raging to the south. It was a place of small-town comfort, where everyone knew everyone else's business and the biggest excitement came from the harvest festivals or an occasional fire. But there was always something in the air, a strange tension that came from the undercurrent of unresolved matters, from the sense that this was not just a sleepy little town, but a place that was struggling to hold on to something long forgotten. Many of the town's residents had deep roots in the land, families that had been there for generations. They were fiercely independent, clinging to old traditions, and yet they were burdened with the uncertainty of a world that seemed to be slipping away. Some of them were sympathetic to the Confederate cause, while others were Union supporters, yet it seemed like the war had become a distant murmur, something that weighed heavily on the minds of the townsfolk only when they heard reports of skirmishes nearby or when soldiers passed through on their way to the front. For most, the war was just something that didn't belong to them, a far-off tragedy that they tried to ignore while they struggled to keep their lives intact. But even in this pocket of relative peace, the war's shadow loomed, bringing with it a quiet despair. For years, the town had been slowly dying. The local economy, once buoyed by a booming timber trade, had faltered as the resources in the surrounding forests dwindled. The young people who grew up here no longer saw a future in the town, and many had left to seek work in the cities, drawn by the promise of higher wages and greater opportunities. The elderly stayed behind, clinging to the remnants of a way of life that seemed to be vanishing, while the few remaining families struggled to keep their farms running. Over time, the town had become increasingly isolated. Fewer travelers passed through, and the roads grew rougher, almost forgotten. The population dwindled, and the few remaining families became more insular, bound by their shared history and an unspoken sense of isolation. Yet, despite the town's physical decline, there was an air of survival in the people. They were tough, weathered by years of hardship, and they had learned to depend on one another in ways that outsiders might never understand. It was within this fragile community that the child appeared, and the events that followed would seem all the more unbelievable given the town's history. People were used to secrets here, old family feuds, whispered rumors about hidden treasures or long-buried sins. This was a place where everyone had a story, and every story was shaded by the past. But the arrival of the child, with her cryptic words and strange presence, seemed to expose something that the town had tried so desperately to ignore, the dark heart of its own history. For years, the townspeople had told stories, most of them half-remembered and twisted by time. Some spoke of the haunted woods on the outskirts of the settlement, a dark place where strange things had happened in the past. There were whispers about those who had gone missing, families who had vanished without a trace, and strange lights that appeared in the trees at night. The older generations would speak of them in hushed tones, warning children to stay close to home after dark. But most dismissed these tales as mere folklore, things to tell around a campfire, nothing more. The younger folk laughed it off, eager to distance themselves from the superstitions that seemed to hold such a strong grip on their elders. But even as they laughed, there was a collective unease, a sense that something lingered in the shadows of the town's past. Some of the older residents, those who remembered the early years of the town's founding, had spoken of odd occurrences in the past, strange happenings that the younger generations had never known about. In the town's earliest days, there were rumors of strange rituals performed in the woods, of people vanishing, and of dark figures seen on the outskirts of town. These whispers had always been brushed aside as nothing more than the fanciful imaginings of a few old souls, but there were always those who could not quite shake the feeling that something from the past was still waiting to be uncovered. And so, when the child appeared, it was not just a strange event, it felt like the return of something that had been buried for too long. At first, the townsfolk tried to rationalize her presence, to find a simple explanation that would fit within their worldview. She must have come from one of the nearby towns, they said, or perhaps she was the daughter of a family displaced by the war. But no one could explain the child's eyes, eyes that seemed to hold a depth beyond her years, eyes that reflected the darkness of the world in a way that seemed out of place in a young girl. No one could explain her eerie calm, her lack of fear, her cryptic words. It was as though she had walked straight out of one of the old stories, one of the tales about the darkness in the woods or the secrets of the town that no one dared to speak. The more the townspeople tried to ignore it, the more the child's presence seemed to hang over the community. The people were afraid, though they could not say why. There was no clear reason for the fear that had taken root in their hearts, no event that triggered it. It was simply a growing sense of dread that seemed to settle over the town like a thick fog. The once cheerful morning greetings from neighbors turned to uneasy silence. People began to avoid the areas near the woods, and those who had once been the first to gather at the market began to disappear, unwilling to speak of their growing discomfort. The town that had once been a place of quiet serenity was now filled with an undercurrent of tension and suspicion. Those who had once believed in the peaceful rhythms of their lives began to question what had really been happening around them. Had the child's arrival been the tipping point, or had it simply brought the dark secrets of the town to light? Whatever the case, it was clear that something had changed, and no one would be able to look at their quiet little settlement in the same way again. The strange child, with her cryptic words and unnerving presence, had set something into motion, and the town would never be the same. As the days passed since the child's arrival in the town, the once static rhythm of life began to shift. At first, her presence was seen as little more than a curiosity, a lost soul in need of help, something to be addressed quickly, tidily, and forgotten. The widow who took her in, Mrs. Greaves, was a kind-hearted woman who couldn't bear the sight of a child left alone in such a state. The girl, after all, was no older than 10, perhaps even younger. Her eyes were wide and dark, her skin pale and drawn as if she had been living in the shadows for far too long. There was an odd stillness to her, a calm that unsettled those who came near her, as if she had seen the world differently than others. Despite the discomfort she caused, Mrs. Greaves was determined to care for the child, if only temporarily. She offered the girl food, clean clothes, and a bed in the small, humble cottage she shared with her late husband's belongings. The child, however, would not eat. At first, the widow assumed it was simply the shock of being rescued, the trauma of wandering the woods alone for so long. But as days stretched into a week, the child continued to refuse food. She would sit at the table, staring at the plate before her, her small hands resting on the surface as though deep in thought. When Mrs. Greaves insisted she take a bite, the girl would only nod politely, but nothing would pass her lips. There was an unnerving calmness about her, an eerie stillness that made people uneasy. As the town's few remaining families and farmers came to visit, each was struck by the same sensation: this child did not seem like a child at all. She did not fidget. She did not display the anxiousness that would be expected from a girl who had survived alone in the wild. She spoke with an unsettling maturity, and though her voice was soft and quiet, there was an authority to her words, as if she were not speaking from a position of innocence, but from experience far beyond her years. One afternoon, a local farmer named Jacob Parsons stopped by to drop off some vegetables. Mrs. Greaves invited him inside, and he sat down for a brief chat, though his attention was drawn to the child sitting in the corner, staring out the window at the woods. She hadn't moved for the entire time they'd been there. Jacob, who had lived his entire life in this small town, found it impossible to ignore the strange sensation that seemed to hang in the air whenever the child was near. He wasn't the first to notice it, but something about her eyes, those dark, knowing eyes, made his stomach churn. They seemed to hold secrets, things that couldn't be spoken aloud, things that belonged to a world far removed from this one. "Strange girl, ain't she?" Jacob muttered, trying to shift the conversation to something more comfortable. Mrs. Greaves smiled, but her smile seemed forced, like she too was trying to dismiss the unease. "She's a bit quiet, but she's had a rough time. Lost in the woods for days, they say." Jacob nodded, though he still couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong about the child. "You've noticed it too, haven't you?" he asked, almost as if speaking more to himself than to the widow. "Noticed what?" Mrs. Greaves replied, a slight frown creasing her brow. "The way she stares out at the woods like she's waiting for something, or someone." His words hung in the air like an unspoken truth, something neither of them wanted to acknowledge. The silence between them grew, thick and heavy, until the child spoke up, breaking it with a single sentence that sent a shiver down both their spines. "She's coming," the child whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the wind that blew through the cracks in the walls. Jacob's eyebrows furrowed. "Who's coming?" The child didn't answer. Instead, she stood and walked toward the door, opening it slowly as though she knew exactly what would be waiting outside. Mrs. Greaves and Jacob exchanged uneasy glances before they both stood to follow her. As they reached the doorway, the child stepped out into the cold air, gazing out at the darkened woods beyond the field. Her small figure seemed oddly out of place, standing still, alone, in the gathering dusk. "Who's coming, child?" Jacob asked again, his voice trembling now. The girl did not respond. She simply stood there, staring into the distance, as if waiting for something to appear. The wind rustled through the branches of the trees, but there was no sign of movement, no indication of anything beyond the stillness of the woods. And yet, the air seemed charged with tension, as though something unseen was just on the edge of their perception. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the child spoke again, her voice no louder than a whisper, but carrying an unsettling weight. "The ones who made me," she said. It was a statement that hung in the air like an accusation, though no one knew what she meant by it. Jacob, his face pale, looked at Mrs. Greaves, who simply shook her head in confusion. They both felt the same gnawing unease that had taken hold of them. There was something unnatural about the child, something that didn't belong in their world. As the days wore on, more and more people from the town began to speak of strange things happening near Mrs. Greaves' cottage. Animals, once calm and familiar, began acting erratically. Dogs howled in the night, barking at nothing, and horses became restless, bucking in their stalls for no apparent reason. It was as if the very land around the cottage had become disturbed, unsettled by the girl's presence. Some began to say it was the child who was responsible, that there was something in her, something dark and unnatural, that caused these disturbances. The child, however, remained unaffected. She didn't appear troubled by the animals or the strange occurrences. If anything, she seemed to embrace them, as though they were part of a reality she had come to understand in ways others could not. Her behavior grew increasingly erratic. She would sometimes speak in riddles, her words so strange that no one knew how to interpret them. One day, she told Mrs. Greaves, "The forest will call to me, and when it does, I will go." At first, Mrs. Greaves dismissed this as the ramblings of a frightened child, but as time passed, she found herself growing more and more concerned. What was the child referring to? Why did she speak of the forest as if it were a living thing, something that could summon her? And what did she mean by, "the ones who made me"? The town, too, began to take notice. Whispers spread from one person to another, each new piece of gossip adding more layers to the mystery. Some said she was cursed. Others believed she was the victim of some strange experiment, a child born from unnatural circumstances. Few were willing to say it aloud, but more and more of the townspeople began to suspect that the child was not just lost, she was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in their world. The subtle signs of her growing influence were impossible to ignore. No one could explain the odd occurrences, the strange pull she seemed to have over the natural world around her. No one could deny the fact that every person who encountered her seemed to leave with the same sense of dread, a deep and unsettling feeling that they had touched something they were never meant to touch. Something ancient. Something not of this world. The child had become a symbol of everything the town feared, and no one knew what would happen next. The first person to speak openly about the unsettling nature of the child was an elderly woman named Mary Hines, who had lived in the town for nearly 70 years. Her memory was sharp, and her understanding of the town's history was second to none. She had seen much in her time, both good and bad, and had always been a voice of reason, until the child came. It was on a cool autumn evening when Mary first spoke to anyone about what she had witnessed, and the words she spoke would stir the town into a frenzy of fear and speculation. Mary was a quiet, solitary woman who rarely left her home, a small cottage on the outskirts of town. Her closest companion was a large, scruffy cat named Pippin, who seemed to always be at her side. She had lived alone ever since her husband passed away many years ago, and over time, she had come to enjoy the solitude, finding comfort in the rhythm of her daily life. However, as soon as the child had arrived, that sense of peace had shattered. It started with small things, odd occurrences that Mary could not easily explain. The shadows in the corners of her house seemed darker than usual, and the air itself felt heavier, as though it were thick with something unspeakable. It was when she began to have vivid dreams that she could no longer ignore the feeling that something was deeply wrong. In these dreams, she saw the child, not as she was now, but as something far more disturbing. The girl appeared in the dreams, always in the woods, standing beneath the gnarled branches of the old trees, her dark eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She would speak in strange, half-understood riddles, and the words always carried a sense of impending doom. "They watch us," the child would whisper in the dreams. "They wait for the signal." There was a coldness to her voice, a detachment that felt alien and disconcerting. Mary had woken from these dreams many times, drenched in sweat, her heart racing, but no matter how much she tried to shake off the lingering dread, it followed her throughout the day. One afternoon, after a particularly restless night, Mary decided to visit Mrs. Greaves' cottage. She had seen the girl from a distance a few times, and the unease that had settled in her chest every time she caught sight of her had only grown stronger. She knew that the townspeople were avoiding the subject of the child, but she could not shake the feeling that the girl was a sign of something much darker on the horizon. When she arrived at Mrs. Greaves' door, she was greeted with a warmth that contrasted sharply with the coldness she felt inside. The widow invited her in, offering a cup of tea, but Mary's mind was elsewhere. "Mrs. Greaves," she said after a long pause, her voice trembling slightly, "I've seen things, dreams, terrible things. And I can't ignore them anymore." The widow's face softened with concern. "What do you mean, Mary?" "It's the child," Mary whispered, glancing toward the corner where the girl sat in her usual position, staring blankly at the window. "She's not just lost. She's not just a victim. There's something about her. Something wrong." Mrs. Greaves frowned, clearly uneasy. "What do you mean?" "She's been through so much, Mary. She's just a child." Mary shook her head, her frail hands gripping the edge of her chair. "No, she's not. I've seen her, in my dreams. She speaks to me. She speaks of things that I don't understand, things that scare me." The child, who had been silent for the duration of the conversation, suddenly turned her head. Her eyes, wide and black as the night, locked onto Mary's with an intensity that sent a chill through her spine. "They hear you," the girl said, her voice barely a whisper, but unmistakable. "They know you've seen them. They will come for you." Mrs. Greaves looked at Mary, confused and alarmed. "What did she say?" Mary's heart pounded in her chest. She had not spoken of her dreams to anyone, and yet here was the child, reciting the same cryptic words she had heard in her sleep. "How does she know?" Mary whispered to herself, more to the child than anyone else in the room. The girl stood up abruptly and moved toward the window, peering out at the darkening woods. "They watch. They always watch," she said, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Then, without another word, she returned to her seat in the corner, resuming her eerie silence. Mary couldn't shake the feeling that the child was more than just an innocent victim of circumstance. There was an intelligence behind her words, a calculating coldness that did not belong to a child. She left Mrs. Greaves' cottage that evening with a heavy heart, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just witnessed. She knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. By the following week, the town was buzzing with the whispers of Mary's visit. Some dismissed it as the ramblings of an old woman, a product of her overactive imagination, while others began to share their own strange experiences with the child. It was one evening when Thomas Rourke, a carpenter from the town, came forward with his own story. He had been working late in his shop when he swore he saw the child standing in the doorway of his barn, just beyond the threshold of the light. "I thought it was a trick of the eyes, just a shadow or something," Thomas recalled. "But I swear, when I looked up, there she was, standing at the door, looking at me like she knew me, like she was waiting for something." The child's presence, which had once been a distant curiosity, was now taking on a more sinister tone. People began to see her in their dreams, to hear her voice in the whispers of the wind. It was as if she had infiltrated the very fabric of the town's life, weaving herself into the quiet, unnoticed corners where no one dared to look. Then, there was the incident with young Lucy Farmer, the daughter of a nearby couple. Lucy had been playing near the woods when she claimed to have seen the child standing in the clearing, her arms stretched out as if beckoning her to come closer. Lucy had been so frightened that she ran back home, but she could not forget the strange, compelling look in the child's eyes. Lucy's account was just one of many that began to surface. People reported hearing whispers in the woods at night, seeing shadows that moved where there should have been none. The girl, it seemed, was everywhere and nowhere at once. The town, once a place of simple folk and simple lives, now found itself grappling with something that defied explanation. Some claimed that the child was a spirit, a messenger from another world. Others whispered that she was a witch, cursed or chosen by dark forces beyond their understanding. But no one could say for certain. What began as a series of unsettling, fragmented events was now spiraling into something far more terrifying. The child's influence was growing, and with it, the mystery surrounding her was expanding beyond the town's small, isolated borders. As the whispers grew louder and more widespread, there was a palpable shift in the town's collective psyche. People began to avoid the child, not out of hatred, but out of fear, fear of what she represented, fear of what might be coming for them. The town's residents were no longer sure of what they were up against, but they all knew, deep in their bones, that something had changed. Something that could not be undone. The child, though she said little, had cast a long shadow over the lives of the townsfolk, and now they were left to wonder, was she merely a lost soul, or something far more dangerous? As the whispers of the child's strange presence continued to swirl through the town, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The unease that had settled in the hearts of the residents was not easily ignored, but it was also something that many were unwilling to acknowledge. There was a growing rift between those who believed something supernatural was at work and those who were determined to rationalize the events as nothing more than coincidence or hysteria. For the latter group, the arrival of the child, and the strange occurrences that followed, became a threat to the tightly held sense of order and faith that had defined the town for generations. Among those most adamant in denying any supernatural influence was the town's preacher, Reverend Jacob Wilkes. A man of devout conviction, he had served as the spiritual leader of the community for more than 30 years. His sermons were long, yet comforting, reinforcing the core principles of faith, family, and the promise of salvation through the Lord. He had always been seen as a pillar of stability in an otherwise unpredictable world. Yet, as the rumors about the child's eerie behavior spread, the Reverend's calm exterior began to crack. At first, he dismissed the talk of the girl being anything other than a lost child, a victim of unfortunate circumstances. He implored his congregation to view her through the lens of compassion, rather than fear. "We are a community of love and kindness," he would say, his voice booming from the pulpit, "and we must open our hearts to those in need, not shrink away from them in fear." His words were meant to soothe, but they seemed to have the opposite effect on many of the townsfolk. It was as if the more Reverend Wilkes urged them to look past the child's odd behavior, the more they were drawn to the unsettling reality that something was wrong. It wasn't long before reports began to surface of strange, inexplicable events happening around the child, things that couldn't be dismissed so easily. People claimed to have heard her voice in their dreams, speaking cryptic words that rattled their minds. There were stories of animals acting strange, of dark shadows moving where they shouldn't be, and of an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to follow anyone who came into close contact with her. Some believed that she was cursed, others thought she was a witch, while still others whispered that she was a demon in disguise. The growing chorus of fear was impossible to ignore, yet Reverend Wilkes was steadfast in his resolve to reject any such talk. "Do not be swayed by superstition," he warned during one particularly tense Sunday service. "Fear is the weapon of the devil, and we must not give in to it. This child is no different from any other. She is lost, yes, but she is a child of God, and it is our duty to care for her, not to fear her." Despite the Reverend's sermons, his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The more he tried to suppress the fears surrounding the girl, the more the town began to fracture. It wasn't just the child's odd behavior that unsettled the townspeople, it was the sense that something deeply wrong had been unleashed upon their once peaceful home. And as much as they longed to believe in the comforting certainty of their faith, the growing darkness they felt could not be ignored. It was as though the very fabric of their reality was starting to unravel. In an attempt to reassert control, Reverend Wilkes called a town meeting, gathering the residents together in the church. He hoped that a show of unity would calm the growing anxiety, but the opposite happened. As the people filled the pews, a heavy tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The town's unease was palpable, and it was clear that no amount of reassuring words from the Reverend would ease the mounting fear that had taken root in their hearts. "I do not believe that we should give in to these rumors," Reverend Wilkes began, standing tall in the pulpit. His voice, usually so strong and comforting, now sounded strained. "We must trust in the Lord's plan and not allow our hearts to be led astray by superstition and fear." But the murmurs from the congregation only grew louder. One man, his face flushed with anger, stood up and shouted, "What about the animals? What about the children? Something's not right. This isn't normal." His voice cracked with a mixture of fear and frustration, and it was clear that he was not the only one who felt that something was terribly wrong. Others began to chime in, recounting their own experiences with the child. There were accounts of strange dreams, disturbing sensations, and an overwhelming presence that couldn't be explained by reason alone. The more they spoke, the more Reverend Wilkes felt the grip of doubt tighten around him. He had always prided himself on being a man of reason and faith, but now, in the face of such intense fear and confusion, even his own convictions began to waver. The town's growing divide between belief and fear became a chasm that could not easily be bridged. The Reverend continued to preach that the child was a test of their faith, a challenge to their ability to love and forgive. "Do not give in to fear," he repeated, his voice now almost pleading. "This is not the way of the Lord. We are called to love the sinner, not to fear them." Yet, as the weeks wore on, the situation only grew worse. Those who had been steadfast in their belief that the child was nothing more than a lost soul began to question everything they had once believed. The events surrounding her continued to defy logic. The whispers grew louder, and the shadow of fear stretched further into the community. Some families began to lock their doors at night, refusing to let their children anywhere near Mrs. Greaves' cottage. Others began to keep their distance from one another, wary of anyone who had come into contact with the child. The once strong bonds of community began to fray, and suspicion filled the air. It wasn't just the townsfolk who were affected. Even Reverend Wilkes found himself growing uneasy. His prayers seemed to fall flat, his sermons less powerful. His confidence, once unwavering, was starting to crumble beneath the weight of the fear that had taken hold of the town. He had always seen himself as a protector of faith, a guide for his congregation through the storms of life. But now, he was faced with a storm of a different kind, one that threatened to swallow everything he had ever believed. Desperation began to set in, and it wasn't long before the Reverend sought help from outside the town. He sent letters to distant clergy members, hoping for guidance, for a solution. But the responses he received were not the comforting words he had hoped for. Many clergy members, when hearing of the child's strange behavior, refused to get involved. A few even warned him to be cautious, to not let superstition and fear cloud his judgment. But none offered any concrete answers. The Reverend began to feel increasingly isolated, both from his own faith and from the community he had spent a lifetime serving. In the end, it was not just the child's strange presence that tore at the town's fabric, it was the inability to reconcile fear with faith. The town, once united by a shared belief in God and one another, had been ripped apart by a force neither reason nor religion could explain. And as Reverend Wilkes continued to deny the supernatural forces at play, he unknowingly pushed the community further into the abyss, unable to see that his own denial was as dangerous as the fear he sought to suppress. The town's descent into suspicion and dread had only just begun, and Reverend Wilkes' efforts to suppress it only seemed to fuel the fire. The longer the child remained, the stronger the whispers became, and the more the town's sense of normalcy slipped further out of reach. The battle between faith and fear would define the fate of the community, and neither side was prepared for the horrors that lay ahead. As the weeks wore on, the psychological toll on the town became impossible to ignore. What had begun as a series of strange occurrences surrounding the child had now morphed into a pervasive, collective dread that affected nearly every aspect of daily life. At first, the residents tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but with each passing day, it became more apparent that the unease was not going to fade. The once close-knit community, bound by tradition and shared history, found itself divided, not just by their beliefs in the supernatural, but by a much deeper, more insidious fear, the fear of the unknown. The child, who had once been nothing more than a mystery to the townspeople, now seemed to hold an undeniable influence over them. Her presence, though silent and often passive, was like a shadow that hovered over the entire town. People who once passed one another with smiles now exchanged wary glances, speaking in hushed tones whenever they mentioned the girl or the strange happenings surrounding her. Even the most rational among them, those who had dismissed the rumors as superstition, began to feel the weight of the strange atmosphere pressing in on them. It was not just the fear of what the child might be, it was the slow realization that something had been irreparably altered in their world. The once familiar town had become an alien landscape, where nothing seemed quite right. The air felt heavier, the shadows deeper, and the spaces between people had grown wider, more filled with suspicion and discomfort. Those who had once been friends now avoided one another, not out of animosity, but because there was a sense that the very act of being near another person made them complicit in whatever was happening. It was as though the child had become a mirror, reflecting the town's worst fears and anxieties, magnifying them until they were impossible to ignore. The psychological strain began to show in subtle, yet disturbing ways. People's sleep patterns were disrupted, and a growing sense of paranoia began to take hold. Some of the more sensitive residents started experiencing vivid dreams, nightmares that were more than just fleeting images. They were vivid and persistent, filled with disturbing visions of the child standing at the edge of the woods, calling out to them. There were reports of people waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearts racing as though they had been running from something. These dreams were not just isolated incidents, they were shared by nearly every person in town who had been near the child for an extended period of time. One particular case was that of Gregory Howard, a well-known blacksmith in the town. He was a man of practical means, known for his work ethic and his straightforward approach to life. He had initially dismissed the rumors about the child, chalking them up to nothing more than idle gossip. However, one night, after working late in his forge, he walked home alone through the winding streets. He had never been a superstitious man, but on this particular night, something was different. He felt an uncanny presence following him, something just out of sight, but always there, lingering at the periphery of his vision. As he reached his doorstep, he turned to look back, but there was nothing. Only the empty street, bathed in the cold glow of the moon. He dismissed it as fatigue, a trick of the mind after a long day. But the following night, the feeling returned. This time, as he walked through the darkened streets, he heard something behind him, a soft footfall, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. When he turned to look, there was nothing again. The oppressive silence weighed on him like a physical force, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The next morning, Gregory's demeanor had changed. He was more withdrawn, more irritable, and his usual confidence was replaced by a kind of distant unease. He told no one about his experience, but the change in him was undeniable. He began to avoid certain parts of town, especially near Mrs. Greaves' cottage, where the child was often seen. His sleep was plagued with nightmares, and his normally sharp focus at the forge was now clouded with the sense that something was just out of reach, something lurking in the dark. Soon, his once steady hands began to shake as he worked, his usually perfect strikes with the hammer becoming erratic, as if the very act of crafting metal had become an insurmountable task. It wasn't long before other townsfolk began to notice similar changes in their own behavior. Some began to drink more heavily, seeking to numb themselves against the gnawing fear that had become part of their daily lives. Others withdrew into themselves, avoiding social interactions and keeping their homes tightly shut, as if the very act of leaving their houses exposed them to the growing terror outside. A few even began to see doctors, though none could find any physical cause for the symptoms they were describing. There was no illness, no fever, no sign of any injury or infection, just an overwhelming sense of dread, as though the town itself was being consumed by some invisible force. The church, once the cornerstone of the town's spiritual life, was no refuge. Reverend Wilkes, despite his firm stance against the growing fear, could no longer deny that something was happening. His own faith, which had always been a source of strength, now felt hollow. He had tried to suppress the fear, to offer comfort, but it was clear that the power of his words was no longer enough. He began to have doubts that he had never experienced before. At night, he would wake with the sound of the child's voice echoing in his ears, and no matter how many prayers he said, the fear would not subside. As more townspeople began to experience similar psychological distress, a sense of hopelessness began to settle over the town like a heavy fog. People spoke less and less about the child, but the fear was still there, hanging in the air, suffocating everything it touched. Conversations would halt abruptly when someone mentioned her name, and eyes would dart nervously in every direction as if the very mention of the girl might summon her presence into the room. The town's daily life, which had once been so predictable, now seemed to fall apart under the weight of its collective fear. The harvest, usually a time of community gatherings and celebration, passed with little fanfare. The usual feasts were sparse, the fields went untended as families grew too anxious to work, their minds filled with thoughts of what might be lurking in the shadows. Farmers reported strange incidents, crops that seemed to wither overnight, animals that refused to come out of their pens, and a chilling, unnatural quiet that settled over the land each night, as if the world itself was holding its breath. In an effort to regain control, the town's leaders began to meet more frequently, attempting to come up with a solution. But no one had answers, and as the days passed, it became clear that the town was no longer capable of finding a way to rid themselves of the child or the fear she had brought with her. It was not just a mystery now, it was a crisis. The psychological toll on the community had reached a breaking point, and the town was teetering on the edge of collapse. But amid the growing hysteria, the child remained an enigma. She said nothing, did nothing to directly incite fear, and yet it was her mere existence that seemed to pull the town deeper into its spiraling descent. It was as though she had become a symbol of everything the town could not control, everything it could not understand. And the longer she stayed, the more the town's fragile sanity slipped away. The darkness that had once been a shadow now seemed to be a presence, an oppressive, undeniable force that grew stronger each day. It was clear now that the town was no longer a community of individuals living peacefully side by side. It was a place where fear had taken root in the deepest corners of the human psyche, and nothing could drive it out. What had once been a quiet, unremarkable town was now a place of darkness and paranoia, where the lines between reality and nightmare blurred, and the psychological toll of the child's presence began to wear away at the very foundation of what had been. In the face of the growing psychological and supernatural turmoil that plagued the town, a few determined individuals began to seek logical explanations for the phenomena. For many, the gradual erosion of reality itself was too much to accept as purely a result of superstition and fear. The whispers of dark forces and supernatural origins became increasingly difficult to dismiss, but some were not ready to surrender entirely to such explanations. Among them were the more rational-minded members of the town, those who had always relied on reason and logic to guide their lives. They could no longer ignore the eerie events unfolding, but they were resolute in their belief that there must be a scientific, natural explanation. The mystery of the child, of what she was and what she represented, could not simply be a matter of spiritual or supernatural forces. There had to be a concrete cause, something rooted in the physical world. One of the most vocal advocates for this line of thinking was Dr. Samuel Price, a physician who had lived in the town for several years. A man of reason and intellectual rigor, Dr. Price had always been skeptical of anything that smacked of the supernatural. He had seen his fair share of strange illnesses, psychological afflictions, and medical anomalies in his years of practice, but never had he encountered anything as unsettling as the effects the child seemed to be having on the town. Driven by both professional curiosity and a desire to restore a sense of order to the increasingly unstable town, he took it upon himself to investigate. Dr. Price began by examining the townspeople who had been most affected by the child's presence. He started with Gregory Howard, the blacksmith whose hands had begun to tremble with anxiety, and whose sleep had been plagued by disturbing dreams. In a private consultation, Gregory spoke of the intense sense of dread he felt whenever he was near the girl, and of the strange and vivid dreams he had experienced, dreams in which the child was standing in the woods, watching him with eyes that seemed too knowing for her age. Dr. Price listened carefully, taking notes as Gregory described his experiences. He noted the physical symptoms, the trembling hands, the erratic sleep patterns, and the psychological toll the child's presence seemed to have on him. It was not uncommon for people to experience such disturbances in extreme circumstances, and Dr. Price was determined to find out whether there was an explanation rooted in science. The first possibility he considered was mass hysteria. A phenomenon where groups of people, exposed to the same unsettling stimulus, begin to experience similar symptoms of fear, paranoia, and psychological distress. In his medical journal, Dr. Price outlined a hypothesis that the fear surrounding the child was spreading like a contagious disease. The human mind, when confronted with something it could not understand or explain, was prone to filling in the gaps with fear. This fear, he theorized, could manifest in physical symptoms, nightmares, trembling, irrational behavior, all of which seemed to align with what the townspeople were experiencing. To test his theory, Dr. Price began to visit more families in the town, carefully observing their reactions to the child and the strange events surrounding her. He conducted interviews, asking residents about their experiences with the child, and keeping a close eye on their physical and mental states. He began to notice patterns. Many of the individuals who had been in close contact with the child seemed to exhibit similar psychological responses. The nightmares, the anxiety, the deep sense of dread, all of it appeared to be rooted in a shared psychological reaction to an unknown source. It was, Dr. Price concluded, a case of mass hysteria. But this theory left him with one troubling question: what was causing the hysteria in the first place? He had no doubt that the fear was real, but the source of it was elusive. He could not shake the feeling that something more than mere psychological contagion was at play. Dr. Price turned to other possible explanations, environmental factors, for instance. He began to explore the geography of the area, the conditions of the land surrounding the town, particularly the woods where the child had been found. There had been reports of strange behavior among animals, and some had even suggested that the land itself might be cursed. Was it possible that there was something in the environment, a particular plant, a mineral, or a chemical compound, that was having an effect on the townspeople's minds? Dr. Price took a trip into the woods to investigate further. Armed with a journal and a keen sense of observation, he combed through the area where the child had been found, hoping to uncover some natural explanation for the phenomena that had been occurring. He noted the unusual density of the trees, the almost unnatural stillness of the air, and the eerie silence that seemed to permeate the woods, even during the day. The further he ventured into the forest, the more unsettled he became. There was something about the place that felt wrong, but he pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the task at hand. His investigation yielded nothing conclusive. There were no signs of unusual plants or chemicals, and nothing in the soil seemed to be affecting the local wildlife in any way that would explain the psychological disturbances plaguing the town. Still, Dr. Price could not entirely shake the sense that something in the environment was influencing the residents. But he had no evidence to support it, and without concrete proof, his theory could only remain speculation. Frustrated, Dr. Price turned to another possibility, a psychological condition known as folie à deux, or shared psychosis. This rare disorder occurs when two or more people, isolated from the outside world, begin to share the same delusions and hallucinations. It was possible, Dr. Price considered, that the townspeople were collectively experiencing a form of shared madness, triggered by the child's unsettling presence. The girl had been living in Mrs. Greaves' cottage, isolated from the rest of the town, and it was possible that the sense of dread surrounding her had infected the residents, much like a contagion. This theory, however, offered no explanation for the child's peculiar behavior or her strange statements. As the days passed, the tension in the town only deepened. Dr. Price's theories, though rooted in science, did little to alleviate the fear. The townspeople were no longer concerned solely with the rational explanations of their condition. They were driven by an instinctive, primal fear, one that could not be explained away by reason. And so, despite Dr. Price's best efforts to find a logical explanation, the mystery of the child remained unsolved, and the fear surrounding her grew stronger with each passing day. What was it about this child that was so disturbing? Was it merely the psychological contagion of mass hysteria, or was there something more to her presence in the town? The longer the child stayed, the more the townspeople were consumed by these questions. And as their rational explanations faltered, the door to the supernatural remained wide open. Dr. Price, though determined to find a natural cause, could not deny that the longer he investigated, the more he began to wonder if the town's fears were not entirely without merit. Was it possible that the child was not just a product of mass hysteria, but something far darker? As the fears surrounding the child continued to grow, the town found itself slowly unraveling. What had once been a thriving, close-knit community now felt like a ghost town, its streets empty, its homes silent. The psychological toll was becoming too much for many to bear. Despite Reverend Wilkes' attempts to rally the town with sermons of faith and comfort, it was clear that the foundation of the community was eroding. Even his own words, once a source of strength, now seemed hollow, as though they were no longer capable of stemming the tide of dread that was sweeping through the town. The child had become an obsession, not just a mysterious figure, but a symbol of everything the town had lost, its sense of security, its cohesion, and its peace. She was now a figure of terror, and her mere presence had fractured the town's once strong ties. The anxiety that gripped the residents was no longer limited to just a few people, it had spread like wildfire, touching every household, every family. The town was no longer a place of warmth and community but a place of suspicion, isolation, and fear. The streets, which had once been filled with the sounds of children playing and neighbors chatting, were now eerily quiet. People hurried from their homes to the markets and back, their eyes darting nervously as they passed one another. It was as if the very act of speaking to someone was a potential risk, an exposure to something unknown, something dangerous. Children were no longer allowed to play outside, and families kept their doors locked tightly at night, as if locking out not just the cold, but the growing dread that loomed over them all. At the center of it all was Mrs. Greaves' cottage, where the child was living. It had become a place of fear and superstition. People crossed the street to avoid walking near it, casting furtive glances toward the small house as if expecting something to emerge from its dark windows. Mrs. Greaves, once a beloved and respected member of the town, had become a pariah. Her connection to the child made her a subject of scorn and suspicion. She had always been known for her quiet demeanor, her charitable nature, but now, the townspeople whispered about her as if she were a witch, cursed by her association with the child. One evening, a group of men gathered in the local tavern to discuss what they had all been avoiding for weeks, what to do about the child. The conversation was tense, as if each word carried the weight of the town's survival. Some argued that they needed to confront the child, to banish her from the town once and for all. Others, more cautious, insisted that any attempt to harm her would only make things worse. But there was a palpable sense that something needed to be done. The town could not continue to live in fear, and yet no one could agree on how to stop the madness that was taking root. At this meeting, Thomas Rourke, the carpenter who had first spoken about the child's unsettling behavior, made a bold suggestion. He argued that it was not enough to simply avoid the girl, they needed to take drastic action. "This has gone on long enough," he said, his voice rising with urgency. "We can't keep pretending that nothing is wrong. Something is happening, something unnatural, and it's time we did something about it before it destroys us all." Some of the men nodded, though their faces were strained with doubt. They had heard the stories, the whispers about the child's strange influence, but the idea of confronting her directly, of somehow banishing her, felt like stepping into the unknown. The fear of the child had transcended mere superstition. It had become an existential threat, and none of them knew how to face it. Meanwhile, in the quiet of Mrs. Greaves' home, the child seemed oblivious to the mounting fear around her. She sat in her usual corner, staring blankly out the window, her large, unblinking eyes reflecting the growing unease of the town. It was as though she was waiting for something, or perhaps, for someone. Her silence had become deafening. She no longer spoke the cryptic words she had once uttered to those who had dared to approach her. Instead, she simply watched, as though she were biding her time. One night, after weeks of tense silence, the town's collective anxiety finally reached a breaking point. A group of residents, led by Thomas Rourke and several others who had long been vocal in their fear, gathered outside Mrs. Greaves' cottage. The air was thick with tension as they stood in a tight circle, whispering among themselves, each person unsure of what to do next. Some carried torches, their flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls of the cottage. Others held makeshift weapons, clubs and pitchforks, tools they had brought with them from their homes. There was no plan, only a shared sense of desperation. Thomas Rourke, his face grim with determination, stepped forward. He knocked on the door of the cottage, his knuckles tapping sharply against the wood. A moment passed before Mrs. Greaves appeared, her face pale and drawn. She seemed unsurprised to see them, as though she had been expecting this moment for some time. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. "What is this about?" she asked softly, her voice carrying none of the fear that had overtaken the rest of the town. "We've come to take the child," Thomas said, his voice low but firm. "We can't let this go on any longer. We have to end it. For the good of the town." Mrs. Greaves stepped back, her expression unreadable. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You can't just take her. It's too late. She's not what you think." But her words fell on deaf ears. The men behind Thomas began to murmur impatiently, their hands tightening around their weapons. They were done listening to explanations. They had reached a breaking point, and in their eyes, the child was the source of the town's torment. The door swung open, and the child appeared in the doorway. She was as still and silent as ever, her dark eyes scanning the group of men before her. There was no fear in her gaze, no sign of emotion at all. She simply stood there, watching them. In that moment, something shifted. The air seemed to grow colder, and the very atmosphere seemed to press down on the group. The child's presence was overwhelming, her silence deafening. And in that silence, something unspoken seemed to pass between her and the men standing before her. It was as if the town's fate had already been sealed, and no matter what they did now, there would be no turning back. A strange, inexplicable tension filled the air as the group stood motionless, unsure of what to do next. Thomas Rourke took a step forward, his hand outstretched, but before he could speak, a sound rang out from the woods, a deep, guttural noise that seemed to come from the very earth itself. The ground trembled slightly beneath their feet, and the men looked around in panic. Whatever this force was, it was not of this world. Suddenly, without warning, the child turned and walked back into the cottage, disappearing from view. The group stood frozen, the sounds from the woods growing louder, more frantic. Something had changed, something beyond their control. The child had not fought back, but she had not surrendered either. And in that moment, the men realized that their struggle was not with her, but with something much larger, something they could not understand. The crowd dispersed, their fear now palpable, and the oppressive weight of dread settled even deeper over the town. The child's influence had not waned, and in fact, it had only grown stronger. The town was slipping into an irreversible collapse, not just physically, but spiritually. It was as though the very essence of the place was being drained away, piece by piece, until nothing remained but an isolated, broken shell of what it once was. The child, whether by design or by mere existence, had become the catalyst for this destruction. And as the town descended further into chaos, it became clear that there was no escape. The events of that fateful night outside Mrs. Greaves' cottage left the town in a state of paralysis, a place where time seemed to stop, its once lively streets now empty, echoing only with the sounds of the wind and the occasional creak of an old house settling. The men who had gathered outside the cottage, armed with fear and uncertainty, dispersed without uttering another word. Their collective sense of urgency had vanished, replaced by a growing, heavy silence that lingered long after they returned to their homes. For the first time in weeks, the town felt strangely still, but this stillness was not peaceful, it was suffocating, like the calm before a storm. In the days that followed, the townspeople did not speak of what had transpired. The air was thick with a quiet that no one dared to break. There were no further attempts to confront the child, no more public meetings or impassioned arguments in the local tavern. Instead, the people of the town withdrew even further into themselves. Those who had once been neighbors now passed each other without a word, their eyes downcast, avoiding contact as if by acknowledging one another, they might somehow invite the same dark fate upon themselves. The child, her strange presence, and the events surrounding her became a collective silence, not forgotten, but unspoken, as though acknowledging the truth would make it all too real. The church, which had once been a beacon of comfort and guidance, now stood as a hollow monument to what had been lost. Reverend Wilkes, too, seemed to have been consumed by the eerie quiet that had taken over the town. His sermons had stopped, his prayers grew more frequent, but less fervent, as though he no longer believed in the power of his own words. He could not bring himself to stand before his congregation and preach the hope that had once been his foundation. His faith, once unshakable, had faltered under the weight of the town's fear, and he could not bear to face those who had looked to him for guidance, now that he himself was uncertain of the path. Mrs. Greaves remained in her cottage, and the child, though still a presence in the town, remained as silent and still as the night she had first appeared. She never ventured far from the house, and those few who had once dared to approach her did so no more. There was no more curiosity about her origins, no more questions about who she was or where she had come from. The town's preoccupation with her had turned into an avoidance so complete that it bordered on the pathological. It was as if the townspeople had collectively agreed that the less they acknowledged her, the less they had to confront the darkness that had overtaken their lives. But in the quiet, something strange began to happen. The land itself, once vibrant and teeming with life, seemed to suffer under the weight of the town's silence. Crops began to wither in the fields, animals grew sick and died, and the once thriving river that ran through the town grew stagnant and foul. The people who had once worked the land, their hands accustomed to planting and harvesting, now found themselves staring blankly at the withered crops, unsure of what to do next.